Greetings and welcome back to English 102 with Rebecca McCarthy at South Seattle Community College. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Part 2 of 1984. Part 2 of 1984 is interesting because we get to see this evolution of relationship between two of the main characters, Julia and Winston, from their first meeting in the out in the forest and their first sexual act to finally a domestic kind of experience in the room that they rent together. What we see is an interesting relationship because we see an evolution between this beginning space where their relationship, although there's sexual desire between the two of them, but it's very much an act of protest, if you will, against the inner party itself. But by the time we get to the end of Book 2 or Part 2, depending upon which version of 1984 you are reading, you will see that what you end up with actually is more of a touching and quite an intimate domestic relationship between these two characters. One could even argue that by the time we finish Book 2 of 1984, Julia and Winston is most truly in love. Of course, the words love, dearest, my dearest, these are all used in the very beginning of their relationship and their very first physical act together. But I don't think that we see this tenderness or this truly intimate understanding about their relationship until we get to the end of Book 2. Now, what's interesting here is the fact that their relationship starts out as a protest. Indeed, having sex in a clandestine area in some ways is an act of protest. Julia is an interesting character because Julia likes to break the rules. She has a rule herself, right? If you follow the small rules, then you're able to break the big rules. Julia hates the inner party, just as Winston does, but Julia, she was born in part of that generation where the Junior League, she grew up in the Junior League, she grew up in the Anti-Sex League. She is the new generation that has been indoctrinated by this pattern of history changing and this pattern of the creation of the party and the meaning of the revolution in such a way that Winston was not. Winston lived and has memory, indeed, before the revolution ever happened. So for Winston, he remembers how things were different in time. One of the most telling parts of Part 2 is when Winston and Julia are talking about how the inner party works to change history. Julia grew up thinking that the inner party actually were the inventors of airplanes. And Winston remembers that when he was growing up after the revolution, that the inner party claimed that they were only the inventors of helicopters, but not airplanes. Winston actually reminds Julia at one point that airplanes and helicopters, that all these things were invented even before Winston was alive. And so the party could not have invented it. For Winston, this is a profound thing. How the party plays with history itself, changes history, makes Winston feel that he is almost paralyzed. He has lost history in general, and history can only be found for Winston in these lost objects, such as the paperweight that he holds on to. For Julia, on the other hand, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if the inner party created airplanes or if they were created before the revolution. For her, these facts don't matter. And she also doesn't care that history has been changed. Julia is a woman who must and actually does live in the moment. Because from the moment she was alive, that is all she knew. History has always been a flexible reality for Julia. So she has learned to ignore the importance of maybe a historical fact or historical artifact. But that is not the same for Winston himself. So we have a kind of interesting dichotomy here between these two characters because of their age difference. Julia is about 26. Winston is 37, I believe, so there's an 11-year difference. And this 11-year difference actually makes a huge difference in how they view the party, how they view rebellion, and how they view the history and the importance of history. For Julia, it is enough just to accept the inner party for what it is and to even keep some of the doctrine that the inner party has given, even though she absolutely hates the inner party. So it's okay to break these rules, but it's not necessarily okay to challenge the structure as a whole. For Winston, on the other hand, he desires to challenge the structure of the whole. It's not enough just to break the rules. For Winston, he desires this revolutionary group that may exist in which will uprise at some point in time and take the inner party down. This is what he desires. And between these two characters, we see something extremely interesting. I want to jump to a modern day example, if I can, and have us think about this a little bit, especially since we're thinking a lot about power relationships and how we negotiate power relationships in everyday life. I want you to consider the Occupy movement as compared to the Tea Party. There are often two different ways in which people try to challenge power relationships. One of the most common ways is to become part of the system, that is, become, for example, an elected official, and then work for change from the inside out. That once you become part of the system itself, you start to convince other members inside the system that change is needed. And so then you create laws or you create different forms of rules and regulations in which to change the system. The other philosophy is that if you become part of the system, then you're not going to be able to create change. So therefore, you have to work from the outside to destroy the system itself in order to have a clean slate available to create a new power structure. So these are two very interesting and very different psychological points of view of how you can create change in power relationships. In our world, we see that the Tea Party has chosen to work inside the system for the most part. Here's a group of people who were very vocal and who had a lot of protests and worked really hard, especially in 2008 and 2010, to be elected members of our government. And they wanted to work inside the system to create change. But let's look at the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement is entirely different. They do not want to have anything to do with the system at all, simply because they are convinced that by becoming part of the system itself, that they will become indoctrinated and thereby will not be able to make effective change. So you have two very different points of view on how to create change, if you will. And both of these points of view are valid, and both of them have worked historically in different circumstances throughout history. Now, in 1984, you can kind of say, for example, that Julia wants to work inside the system. She's not really interested in challenging the structure as a whole. Her interest really is to fault the system from inside the system itself. Winston, on the other hand, thinks that that's where the danger is, that if you become part of the system, then you will become indoctrinated by the system. So while you're reading part 2 of 1984, I'd like you to take a few minutes and really consider this idea about what it means to create change, palatable change, within a power relationship dynamic. And this can be applied to not only government situations, it could be applied to everyday situations. For example, between an employer and an employee, between a mother and father and their children, between friends even. There are all sorts of different ways in which we try to create change, and under different circumstances, change is more likely to be created using different techniques, such as we see the technique of the Occupy movement as compared to the technique of the Tea Party. And as a final example, just to show that working outside the system to destroy the system, one hopes in order to create change, actually works in our world, consider what happened over in Egypt. And I've posted a few videos about and articles about the Egyptian revolution and how it came about. So look at that and consider how that government was, how the revolution rose, and what is going on now. The success that the people of Egypt were able to establish is partly because they worked outside the system itself. So it's just something for us to think about. And that's all I have to say right now for part 2 of 1984. I hope you enjoy reading this section. Do be prepared because part 3 is kind of heart-wrenching. And I have nothing more today, so I will see you on the boards. Thank you very much, and goodbye.